says David Farland, and Scott James McNamara. I don't let you introduce yourselves.
All right. It's going to take a while, so I'll go first. Okay. My name is Scott James McNamara. I used to write hobby games, game violence, and now I write fiction. A lot of people say it's kind of the same thing, but there's different ways to go about it. You can research what you do for each project, and that's one of the reasons why I wanted to do this now.
And I'm this David Farland. I write fantasy, which is generally speaking based upon realistic medieval depictions. But I've also recently won, a couple of years ago, I won the Wiki Award for Best Book of the Year with my historical novel, On My Way to Paradise. So I've also done a little bit of historical work, and of course that requires a lot of research. But I am a big fan of research anyway, so that's why I thought this would be a fun time to be on.
Thank you so much for joining us today, gentlemen. So what we would like today is I'll go ahead and kick off with a question, and then I would like to open it up to you because the audiences have been asking some fantastic questions and far better than I can come up with. So if you have questions and you would like to pose them, please approach the microphone and we will let you ask away. So to begin, I would like to ask you gentlemen to share what it is about writing in the past that appeals to you most.
That was a look. What I like about writing in the past is it's a journey of exploration, right? They call the future the undiscovered country. Well, the past is the unremembered country because none of us were there, right? Unless we're fantastically old, not telling anybody. Very few of us saw the beginning of the Depression. However, our parents might have. And so our parents give us the stories of the Depression, and when we write about them or tell them to our children, and a little bit gets lost along the way, but we keep it alive. And the farther back you go, the less you actually know about what really happened. And discovering it from tiny bits of fragments here is just fascinating. It's a glorious ride.
Yeah, it tells us a lot about where we came from. I have a theory that I've told people in my writing classes is that you can pick any year, any time, and just go back and say, okay, so 1634. What happened in 1634? And probably nobody in here can tell me one thing that, maybe one of you can come up with one thing that happened in 1634, but the majority of people have no clue. And yet, when you sit down and start researching the year and start looking at what really happened, you go, oh my gosh, I didn't realize that was the year that the Spanish Armada set sail for, blah, blah, blah. And you start finding all sorts of fascinating connections. And every time that I do that, I'll set a year and I'll go start doing some historical research on that year to find out what happened. And I just get lost. I sometimes, in fact, I once decided to set a story during the Mexican Revolution, and after reading books in Spanish on the Mexican Revolution for 40 days, 40 nights, the time came for me to turn the story in, and I just finally said, heck with it, I'm just going to sit there. This was so fascinating. I couldn't stop studying. And so that's for me, that's a lot of the fun of writing and writing. The thing that I have to warn you against is that just because a fascinating story may have happened in history, it's not that easy to write it. I made that mistake early on. I thought, I'll just write what really happened, and that'll be so easy. And make a perfect story, and I'll be done in 3 weeks, and something like that. And it took 2.5 years worth of research before I could even write the dang book, because you really have to keep the details correct.
Bad lives to find.
So do you prefer historical accuracy over artistic license? Or do you think that both have a place?
I prefer to present an entertaining story. Right? This book here is about Pompeii. But I put zombies in it.
The thing about being historically accurate is even if you are historically accurate, you're going to be attacked and pounced upon anyway, so you might as well recognize that historical accuracy has its place, specifically if you're trying to write a biography or something that really is supposed to have happened. But there is so much that is left unsaid historically that it requires you, as soon as you say, he thought, it's all in your imagination. You can't tell us what people really thought at the time. You can have a conjecture about what they might have thought, You can imagine what you might have thought given the circumstances, but you've really got no clue what might have gone through a character's head, say, 400 years in the past. And so, to a certain point, you have to just say, I've got to tell a good story, and make sure that whatever you're telling us is fascinating.
So yesterday during our Breathing Life into Your Characters panel, the concept of writing characters who are not native English speakers came up, and one of the ways that we decided that you could convey that is through word choice.
Mm-hmm.
And I do know that language in the past was really quite different. How much of that do you try to convey?
I try to convey quite a bit of it. In my book, Nightingale, I wrote it, and it wasn't until they started doing the audio tape version that I realized that, oh gosh, I've got, I think I had 8 or 9 different languages, including I have a joke being told in Rome, and so I had to go translate the darn thing into Latin. And so I go for accuracy. When it gets into what they thought and stuff, I try to retain the flavor of what the language was without actually getting into it. Because, quite frankly, if I started writing in Middle English, something 800 years ago, you guys would have a heck of a time trying to figure out what I was saying. And in particular, if you're a new reader, a 9-year-old kid or something like that, it's just indecipherable.
I can't agree with him more. This book here, Hearts of Iron, is written about 1035 AD in an important invasion of Sicily. So the main characters speak Latin, sort of, and French, sort of, and Italian, sort of.
Yep.
They don't. No, why would they? The English didn't speak English. They spoke French and Old English. So, but you go even a couple hundred years before that, after that, in the 12th and 13th centuries, there were 5 different kinds of French, 4 kinds of Spanish, and 3 kinds of Italian, and Latin was just leaving the common parlance and becoming a different kind of language. And an educated person would speak 10 or 12 different languages, because to go from one town to another, you might have to translate. And so the concept of lingua franca that came up has come to mean, the language of France, but what it really ended up being is we all need to speak something, or we can't understand anything. One of the great things about writing fantasy is that a lot of times people just speak the same language, which never happened, ever. And so writing historical accuracy for that is nightmarish,
It
right?
only happened in fantasy and in Star Trek.
Mhm.
They come from wildly different planets and understand each other just fine. I love that.
So but it even comes down to when you go for accuracy, the choices you make as an author are strange. I have a character who's a master strategist, right? You can't use the word strategist
That's right.
when you're writing about 1035, it's from the 17th century. You also can't use the word tactician or general. They had captains, so he's a good captain and his men love him. Or he's a winning.
They love him, right?
Yeah, he's a good captain. So, but when I wrote about Rome, no one speaks Latin but me.
Yeah.
Right, so I don't care so much about the accuracy of some of the words we're in, because it's about ancient Rome, right? And it's a language that's immediately foreign to 90% of the people you're going to meet every day, unless they happen to be Italian. So you don't worry so much about your word choices the further back you go, the more fantastic your thing goes. But when things are just recognizable enough, that's when you get hammered.
Yeah.
Right, I had a guy building a special chair that's like a couch, right? Couch is a verb that we've come to make it now. And so a bench with cushions on it is ancient. The Romans had them, the Greeks had them, the Hittites had them. They didn't call them couches. They called them something different. So in this book I call it a couch, but in this one I call it a bench. Because it matters, your word choice.
Yeah, and a lot of people today don't realize that. I always, every time I see a character, say, speaking in Mummy movies, somebody speaking ancient Egyptian, oh my gosh, what a concept. There was no such thing as ancient Egyptian. I mean, it changed every 100 years, over the course of 16 to 20 centuries.
Who did we conquer this year? What new words have we learned?
Yes, exactly, and so you'll have a word that switched meanings completely over a period of 300 years. And so it's really a tough kind of trick to pull off.
Did any of you have any questions that you wanted to ask of the panel?
See a lot of nodding heads out there, don't be shy.
We don't bite.
We scared them all off now. They're like, let's not write about the past, let's write about the
Please.
future.
Oh, this should be good. He's got notes.
Well, I had one, but now that you've, I don't know if this is on, well. Anyway, I guess
Speak
you
loudly.
can hear
We'll
me.
read it back if necessary.
I was like, I had one question, and then the whole thing you said about language just led me to another, but I'll ask two, since no one else is coming back. So my initial question, let me ask the language question first. What is, so how does one go about researching those issues of language so one does not write
First off, write your story.
anachronistic words into?
Yes.
Write your story first.
Yeah.
Your copy editor will tell you when you got it wrong. But if you want to put your accuracy into it, first off, be familiar with the literature of the time, literature about the time. So some other author may have done that research for you when he wrote his own book about the 13th century. And so you look at the word choices he used and the stylistic choices that some of his characters made, and that'll tell you some of the things that weren't right. But feel free to break the rules too. That's like rule number 6, is break the rules.
Yeah. And one of the things that I do is, like, for example, when I was writing mummy books and things like that, I would go through and I would do research on the English word that I was looking for. And usually in my Egyptian dictionaries, it would say, used in 1600 to 1400 BC it meant this, and so I could sit down and sort of figure out how to cobble together how they might have spoken it in the era that I wanted. And probably if I really wanted to get some accuracy, I would have gone to some professors, because there are linguists that study this kind of thing, and a lot of them are sort of like, oh my God, somebody asked me a question finally after 32 years. and yeah, they love talking to you about this kind of thing. They get it. I used to work for a linguist when I was doing editing at BYU, and he would get so excited. I'd ask him, so what was, I'd ask him in a meeting with some ancient word or something, and he'd just start jumping around, and it was just really fun to watch how excited he would get with that. So, and what he'd do is he'd say, oh, you want to do that accent? And he says, well, hang on here. He had a library of accents, and for example, so if I wanted a Mississippi accent from the 1940s, he would get an old woman that was taped in 1936 or something like that, and he would say, okay, here's an accent from this county, and here's the one from the county next over, and that kind of thing.
So my initial question was going to be, how extensively does your historical knowledge, you feel, need to be about a specific period or place before you run? How fleshed out?
When's my deadline?
Exactly. That's what I do is I research up until my deadline. If I figure it's going to take me, say, 4 months to write the book, then I've got to stop researching at 4 months. And if I do any research, it's got to be the late night kind of thing. And I'll be honest with you, I never can stop. I mean, because I get into it and then I start researching my facts and saying, okay, this is what I remember, and then I've got to go through and make sure that I remember correctly. But one of the things that I do is I'm doing research for a historical novel or something, is I write out a Bible, sort of interesting things and facts and stuff from that era as I go. So, for example, when I wrote the book that won the Whitney Award, the book was 350 pages long, but my notes were 400 pages long. So.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi. One of the big things with me is I'm a little bit frustrated. One of the things with me oftentimes when I try and read historical novels is the use of materials, say iron versus bronze. How much of an impact would you have you found that's had? Have people often gone, nope, they don't have iron then, or have you found that to be a big influence on your writing?
I had a developmental editor ask me if they had steel in the 11th century, right? Because it was a part of the book? And I said, yeah, quite a bit of it. But they didn't have good steel, or they had different kinds of steel, right? And so when you went across Europe, how they made swords differed as to what they had access to, or do we have ready swords of coal, you know, or is it just an iron bar that I've knocked some edges onto? The use of certain types of materials, I think it's paramount to accuracy. Because you may not, some of you may not know this, but oranges are not native to Europe. They were brought there by the Saracens because they like oranges. So they planted groves all over the Mediterranean because they didn't want to wait for oranges to come fresh. And so you don't see oranges in Europe before 800 AD because the Moors haven't invaded yet.
Can I ask you a general writing question?
Sure.
I've been writing and illustrating a comic book, but I've noticed lately a lot of related material that other people are writing and releasing coming out before mine. So I feel like my content is not fresh anymore. It's not. A lot of it's similar in theme, and so I wonder how you guys deal with that.
Is it still a good story?
I think so.
It's worth telling.
Yeah, and especially with comics, you know, so much of it depends upon the style of the artwork and stuff like that. So there's ways to make things fresh. And sometimes, for example, you know, if you've got let's say a world that feels like other people's worlds, then you might want to concentrate on creating some really fascinating characters to go in that world. Or, you know, great conflicts, just, you know, risingly told story. Or it may be your artistic choices, you know, the words that you use, the poetic diction, the look of your voice, that kind of thing. But what you do is you look for some ways to set your work above others. And if you can do 3 things really well, you'll be a bestseller. Okay? Generally speaking, if all you got to do is do 3 things really well, and then you'll set your standards much higher than the average person.
So I have a question about characters and time differences. Seeing that our paradigm today, our values are very different than past, you know, even 100 years ago. What we value is very different today. And when you're writing protagonists, you want your audience to be able to relate to them, but if you want to be historically accurate, what would be a hero one time period sounds like a complete and utter asshole today.
Yes.
So how do you approach characters being, one, historical, but also being relatable, and also something that we can connect to in values?
It's an extremely difficult thing to do, depending upon the age and everything that you're dealing with. One thing you have to remember is that we often think that we all have sort of similar values, and you don't have to go, you know, within this room, I'm sure that we could start, you know, probing and prodding between Democrats and Republicans and Socialists and get a fist fight within an hour pretty easily. Realize that even historically there were wide differences in the way that people thought, but at the same time, you can't have a completely modern person, you know, coming into the story. So there's a couple of things that I look at. First of all, if I've got a character that does have some dislikable qualities, if they're apologetic about it, you know, if they feel bad for doing that, you know, it's like, I hate treating women like dirt, but, you know, I'm actually treating them better than most guys do, or something like that. You can get away with a lot by being apologetic, but at the other time, at the same time, you've got to give them high ideals, things that we can look at and say, yeah, I really, you know, feel that too. I really want to see that person succeed at the good thing that they're trying to do. And I think that if you present it that way, you can usually get away with an awful lot, you know. I have a theory that one of the things that attracts us to readers is that we look for characters that are good looking, I guess is the way to put it. But when I say good looking, they have a beautiful internal side to them, I guess. And so if you can figure out some way to give that protagonist some internal beauty, I think that'll help a lot. Which means that they've got noble ideals, they've got grand desires, they are giving. They're people that care deeply about others. And usually we also try to put that character in pain because we'll feel for people who are who are put into a bad place. Okay?
There's so much awesome about what you just said. I'm trying to think of it. I write a lot of stories about people who shoot or kill or stab each other. There's nothing wrong with that kind of entertainment. But, I'm also really not going to go write a love story. I want to make sure that the characters I put across are someone you can relate to and believe in, even if they're not nice people. So when you show a guy who's an efficient warrior, don't have him go and pet dogs. Have him be responsible to his men. Have him be a leader. Have him have these admirable qualities that you want someone to have to excuse the horrible things that they have to do. Right?
Yeah.
People say that Hitler was nice to children and a vegetarian. He was still Hitler. So if you're writing a story about Hitler, he's not a happy puppy guy.
Yeah. One of the things that you can look at too is, to a certain degree, as we put on a persona when we're reading a story, we kind of we try to become that person intellectually for a little bit. And one of the things that you can look at is your character's superpowers, is what I call it. And it superpowers doesn't mean that he flies around or anything like that necessarily, but it means that he may be quick-witted, he may be exceptionally passionate, he may be a person who is thrifty, to a fault almost. But
He's got something that other people don't have.
But he's got something other people don't have, and that in some way we wish that we could be more like that. Okay? And so that becomes really powerful too.
Thank you.
Hello, thank you. I have a cold.
So do I.
I'm working on a story about a medieval knight who is placed down in a modern setting of the New York City Police Department. And the medieval knight does have magical powers, and the police are tested in their sense of honor because of that. So I wanted to ask for any tips or comments that you had on blending the modern with the old or with the medieval.
Fantastic question.
Yeah. The knight still has to be compelling,
Okay.
right? So he's your central character from what that pitch says to me. So he's the character I need to follow, and he's the character I need to relate to, even though the New York City Police Department may be someone I understand better. So as you present this knight and what he does and how he goes about his business, he's got to be the most important person in the room. He's got a mission, he's got a calling, there's a reason he's come forward in time, right? So don't worry so much about what's going on 47th Street. Worry about what's going on in that guy's head, and the rest of the story will sort itself out.
Okay. Thank you.
Like if he has to go hail a taxi, right? That's a pretty amusing bit. It's a bit. The robbery is tracking a murderer. I have to believe that.
Thank you.
Hey, thanks for coming out and doing this.
Thank you.
Somebody else already stole my questions, so I didn't think of anyone. It was tough.
Yeah, I got the answer man right here.
He's been killing it. Anyway, so here's a simple one for you. Say you're a new writer, you're going to self-publish. There's a lot of great ways to do that now. And you've got a pretty simple story in your head and you want to get it down. You want to have it set in the past, but you don't have a copy editor to do research for you. Make sure you don't put couches in when couches don't exist. And
Couches existed. They shouldn't call them couches. I'll be really clear about that one because I've had this argument before.
So, you're pretty much on your own and you're not a history buff. Like, I do the research, but it doesn't intrigue me like it does you. In that case, would you say it would be a better idea to step out of historical fiction entirely and plunk yourself down in a fantasy world so you can make your own rules and nobody's going to punish you for making a simple mistake? Or is it not so big a deal?
Here's the thing. If you look at what makes a bestseller, okay, the number one element that people look for is that it transports you to another time or another place. Now, it could be a historical time and place. When The Godfather came out, it was only set, 20 years in the past. But it basically delved into a society that most people were unfamiliar with, okay? And so it transported us into that world. Most of the time when we have a bestseller in historical works, they typically go back about 50 years. If you look at A Tale of Two Cities, something like that, that's just about the right age, because what it does is it speaks to us about our grandparents and our parents a bit. It takes us back in time to a time that intrigues us because we've kind of heard about it a little bit. There was a time, for example, in the 1970s when publishers were saying, we don't want any more stories about the Vietnam War. Well, now's a good time to write a story about the Vietnam War, most likely, because that's something that Grandpa may have fought in. So transporting the reader is really important. Fantasy worlds do that automatically, and science fiction worlds will typically do that automatically. And if you really aren't tied to
grab the
history,
end,
some historical settings, then that's just not important. Probably the fantasy world would be a lot easier for you to handle. On the other hand, don't get world builder's disease. Okay, don't do like Tolkien did. It's been 30 years creating a world and not writing any gosh darn novels. Okay, just go out there and write.
One thing I want to add to that is that if the research isn't grabbing you, do different research.
Yeah.
I mean, you wanted to write the story for a reason. So go back and revisit what that reason was, and then aim your research towards, boy, I really like X. Find out more about X, and then they'll build from there.
And you know what? There are when you're doing research, there are writers of tremendous talent sometimes who can bring a world to life or bring an era to life. And sometimes, for example, if you were writing a Regency romances, there are women who devote their entire life to doing research to find out how many hairs were laying on the floor of the barber shop on February 7th, 1801 in London. And literally, they have their research down. Don't be afraid to go to people who do that kind of research for a living and talk to them. And they can point you towards the best books and maybe help you find something that really does fascinate you.
Thank you very much.
Hi. It's funny you mentioned Regency romance because I kind of have a. Are there any historical accuracies that are just so hard to get past that you just kind of ignore them? Like, I gravitate towards historical romance, and every time I think about somebody kissing, I think about how actually their mouths were really gross. And they smell bad. Depending on how far you go back.
That didn't happen.
Yeah.
People didn't shake hands, they started having indoor plumbing.
Yeah.
For a really good reason. They didn't have toilet paper either. I tend not to show people going to the bathroom or eating or doing a lot of things that we take for granted in every day because we have a really high standard of living.
Yeah.
But you go 100 years ago, 200 years, 100 years ago, most of the houses in America didn't have electricity. Very few had running water, didn't come out of a well. People didn't have cars.
A lot of gross things happened. I mean, I remember when I was a little kid, we had a farm that raised chickens, and my wife just got some chickens, which reminded me about this every day now. But my job as a 6-year-old kid was to chop the heads off the chickens and pluck them so that we could sell them to the neighbors. So I remember getting with my little sister and getting the chickens down, and we both take an axe at the same time, and we chop off chicken heads and have dead chicken races. Talk to somebody who lived, 50 or 100 years ago, everybody did that, But I really wouldn't want to write about that for most of my novels. I think that
It's a bit. It's a scene.
Yeah,
It's a whole book.
Yeah, you wouldn't really like the little kids that were doing that.
So just wiggle around the parts.
If you feel you got it right about someone going to the bathroom or old fashioned, you can write about it, right? But if it doesn't serve your plot, no one's going to notice. They're going to assume it happens.
Yeah.
Lucy and Ricky clearly slept in the same bed at home. But when they put a king-size bed on TV, everyone went, oh. We can't show our married characters almost about to have sex, even though they're having a baby. Right? We know where those come from.
200 years ago, when people slept, families slept usually in the same bed. So you had mom and dad and the kids, and there's a lot of good psychological and physiological reasons for that. Little kids needed the warmth from the adults, and also helped keep away the night terrors and things like that. And I think that there are times when you could take something like that, say a mother lying next to her daughter and her husband at the same time, and actually turn that into a very sweet moment. So you might want to look at ways that you could say, yeah, they did things differently and make it sweet. But it's kind of dangerous, I've seen in one of my novels where it's very important to the plot that I have a mother who's nursing, okay? And I've gotten a number of pieces of mail from women who are just terrified that I'm writing about a woman who's nursing, God darn, that's the way it was done 100 years ago. We didn't have formula. So, and if you went dry like she does, your babies died. That's exactly what happens. So sometimes it plays into the plot. You've got to write the horrible truth anyway.
Thank you.
Welcome back.
Hi, yes, I'm back. I had a question about something that is not as prevalent modernly, especially in the States. And some of the small things I've written, I found that I tend to do this too hard, so I guess I'm looking for a way to soften it. Social stratification. It was not uncommon for officers to rarely actually talk to their men. Officers eat a different mess than their men, especially, I write a lot of Victorian era stuff, so, you were an officer and a gentleman, you ate in the officer's mess. The enlisted men were a different group, they had their social circles, you had yours as an officer, so trying to find the balance between how to still make someone likable, but still make it clear that these social boundaries existed, I guess, is something that I struggle with a little bit, especially along the lines of things like officers and enlisted men, because my father's in the Army, but he's very good friends with all of his superior officers. Not all of them, most of them. Or social lines, especially once you start stepping back farther, especially in certain cultures, the social lines between men and women, making those work. Any particular tips on how to soften that or make that, or do you just sort of end up hand-waving it to a certain extent?
You want to address the Regency or just in general?
In general.
Okay. So the further back you go, the wider the disconnects will get. Like you spoke about your father being in the Army when I was in the Navy. So the thing about 20th century war is that the lieutenant and the corporal could have grown up together, right? This is very fine line about who gets trained this way and who gets trained that way. But in the 19th century, you were an officer because you were born this way. And they were drafted, they were conscripted. They had nothing else to do but pick up this gun and go here, or you were born to lead. And so, of course you're going to lead, don't be ridiculous, right? And it's just a product of the times you're writing and the place you're writing, right? The further back you go, that divide gets nothing, because soldiers succeeded on their own merits, whether they were nobles or not. Nobles clearly had more advantages, they had more money, they probably had better swords, better armor. Knights in armor were rich. Knights without armor were soldiers. They didn't worry about chivalry so much because they had to worry about living.
Yeah, and the disconnect did get, if you were born into a royal family, in England at one point, you may be speaking French and your men may be speaking Celtic or something like that, and you really had almost no interaction with them. But it really varies widely among the ancient Romans.
They spoke Latin or else.
Yeah, they all. But the thing about them that always interested me was the conscripted man could end up becoming a general. Among them. It was based very much on merit to a great degree. And if you've ever been in a society where your advantages come from your birth, you see just how unproductive it is. I worked with a filmmaker in China whose father was a wealthy communist, head of the Ministry for Propaganda. and the guy was just an idiot. You know, it was like, oh my gosh, it was a disaster. It was like making a movie with Ed Wood or something. And I just looked at it and I said, we have nothing to fear from the Chinese because their social stratification it absolutely destroys their ability to do anything, you know, at least in filmmaking.
So is there anything in particular on a little bit less of the military side, more on the social side?
You know, I think that if you make the rules clear and you make the person trying to live within the rules and you bring up the fact that, you know, oh gosh, I'm not supposed to help this milkmaid who just got herself pregnant, you know, by the stable boy, but you know, I'm going to give her 3 pence anyway before we send her out the door. So that you realize that he's trying to do the right thing in a society where, you know, they're fighting against this kind of rules. I think that can work just fine.
Okay, thank you very much.
Hello.
Hi, I have 2 questions actually that are kind of similar. When thinking about like what economy you're going to use, which models do you usually model your societies after?
That's the research right there.
Yeah.
That really comes out when you're studying your time period.
Yeah.
You can't,
You can't fake it.
Yeah, you can't fake that at all. I mean, fantasy, you get to use gold or whatever currency you want, but in a historical setting, it's got to be the real thing.
Yeah.
So look at I worked on a product that was based on medieval Asia, and basically the term economy was called a koku, which was rice. Here's what it cost to feed a guy a bowl of rice every day for a year, and that was an economic unit. And a peasant didn't make that ever,
Yeah.
but nobles made it. It was their birthright. And so everyone made some variant of nothing to koku as part of the economy, and that's how you tried to make that work. In medieval Europe, you got paid nothing whatsoever, and you had to give most of your money away because of the feudal system, right? So if you had anything, if you had enough money for an extra chicken, and somebody found out about it, they come and take your chicken because that clearly didn't belong to you.
Yeah, you just have to do your research, and you know, of course, there's different kinds of barbarous societies, and there's, you know, if you were writing about, say, the ancient Mayans, you know, they used seashells which were put on beaded necklaces, so decorations became your measure of wealth to a certain degree. But then you had other things that you could trade, you know, if you were in a Mayan society, like little balls of red cotton, which you put in your ear, or, you know, you can go back and do the research, but you really have to do the research because we value such different things in different cultures over time, and we've had different methods of handling it, you know.
All right, second question is, when referencing into the past, what politics model do you guys model your societies after and all that?
Same answer.
Same answer, yep, go back and find out.
What about
your research?
a fantasy setting?
Fantasy setting's a little different.
Yeah, that's a little different. You have some variation, things that you can do, and I think it's more fun in fantasy settings to go a little extreme and kind of develop your own rather than working too much upon the historical setting. You know, so for example, most of the European feudal societies, you know, went from father to son. I don't see any reason why you can't have a feudal society that's matriarchal, you know, and to me that's just a little bit more interesting than going with the thing that everybody else has done before. But you have to look at what people value. For example, if I were going to create a society, I would look at not having a person that rules by birthright, but maybe who rules because they are the most intelligent. You know, do I want the person that you know, ended up being brain damaged at birth to become the next king, or do I really want someone who's going to be, you know, instead of inept, apt? I look for apt people. So I might say, okay, so how are we going to choose somebody in this society? Well, maybe it's going to be based upon what they actually give to the society. It may be a matter of personality. How much does this person actually try to benefit society rather than benefit himself? There's all sorts of different ways to measure a man and or woman, and I just kind of look at it and go, what makes sense? See, Tolkien never made any sense, in fantasy. But seriously, I looked at it when I was a kid and I was reading that the first time, and I go, well, these elves live practically forever, and they've got magical powers,
And so they don't rule the world?
and they're faster, smarter, and stronger, and better than humans and orcs and everything else, and yet they're almost baloney. Okay? In fact, one of these days, I love Tolkien. He got me writing, but one of these days I think I need to sit down and write the book on all the things that Tolkien did wrong. If I did, I would utterly destroy his career. Because I would get hate mail. Yeah. The things he did right. But the things he did wrong were pretty amazing, and that was one of the things he did wrong, was having different humanoid species all trying to live on the same planet without ever actually deciding who's going to win.
And who feeds mother's truth?
Yes, exactly.
That's his way to be.
Yeah.
I don't want to let you go just yet, because I want to talk more about your research. When you're writing historical fiction, it's very important to remember that someone somewhere has a doctorate in your book.
Yeah.
Whether you're writing about anything, even remotely inconsequential, someone has a doctorate in that. Someone has spent years and years and years researching the tiniest little weird thing that you think is cool. And so if you get it wrong, you're the one they're going to come after and look at. And they'll show you, in my doctorate, I said this, this, and this, right? So, but it's really easy to get it right. It really is, because if you show an interest in a time period, especially now, right? I could not have written these 2 books without Wikipedia, and I have a pretty decent education.
Yeah.
But I learned everything there was to know about, I knew everything I needed to know to write the book really fast by cross-referencing things on the internet, reading a couple different books, seeing a couple documentaries. You have this wealth of information that's just there and lying there waiting for you to see it, and you just need to go see it.
Yeah. Live research is really great.
Yeah.
And it's important, because if you say you want to set a story that's really nuts, and you want to base it on a feudal system, you have to ask yourself, oh yeah, which feudal system? Are you talking about Germany? Are you talking about France? Are you talking about England? Or are you talking about Ireland? And what years? Because they change the systems.
Okay. What page notes, Louis?
Yeah, sorry. Thank you.
That's what the books are for.
Yeah.
Hi. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great. So I have a question about alternate timelines. If you're writing something in an alternate timeline where things are the same technologically but possibly different politically or vice versa, how much emphasis do you put on the thing that is the same? Does that make sense? So if the political system is different but you have the same technology available, how much emphasis on accuracy do you put on the technology, or vice versa?
So technology is bred by conflict more often than not, because you research something to solve a problem. Right? So conflict doesn't have to mean fighting; it means I have a problem I have to solve.
Right.
So if you have a society where something is different but almost everything else is the same, nothing is different. Things really have to change for it to be interesting. Now that change can be a little crazy. Like Harry Turtledove has made a career of writing the almost.
Yes.
I almost won this war, right?
Yeah.
And then, but what he does is he keeps going and keeps going, keeps going. So 60 years later, you see a dramatically different planet from the one you saw in his American Empire series, right? So 1940, it's almost unrecognizable. But in 1888, pretty easy to see what would have happened this way, what would have happened that way. And so there was a time when air travel in this country was dirigibles. It was going to stay dirigibles. If one of them had blown up, we'd all be riding around in blips.
Yeah.
And it was one of them blew up on film and the entire world saw it. That's why we don't travel by blimp. So they use a different kind of paint.
So the thing that you do is, in Tokyo was one of the things he did right. when Tolkien was writing Lord of the Rings, he would go on and he would have maybe a couple of pages where he would describe, the woods and the flies biting and the horse, plodding and the trees up on the hill and stuff like that. And then all of a sudden we would have elves, okay? And he had a pretty good sense of pacing, so that sense of wonder was brought in on a fairly regular basis. I believe that what you want to do, probably, is to create a story where enough is the same so that we feel familiar with it, that the reality is there. We've got the details right, and just when we're convinced that we know what's going on in this world, present us with one change that goes, oh, wow, that just came out of nowhere, and hits us and gives us that sense of wonder. And for something to give us a sense of wonder, it has to both be strange, but it also has to be it has to be better than we expect. Okay. In other words, it has to either have a better effect. It has to make our life easier. It has to be, I wish that that were the way the world really was. Those types of things. So I look for something that's just the right kind of details, but something that also twists away. So that I go, ooh, cool, at the same time. Okay.
My other question was, did you ever start out with a story that you had in mind for a historical fiction, and then once you did the research, you realized, oh, this isn't going to work? And what do you do when that happens?
The story tells you what to do.
Yeah.
I had a story where I was going to have someone tortured by the Inquisition, right? And then I had to ask the question, Dick, about which Inquisition?
Yeah.
And what kind of torture? There was torture that was harsh language.
Yeah.
Right? It would be days and days and days of harsh language, but it was still torture. And people got to confess that at announcement. And the racks and thumb screws, that's a little different. They hit you with a sack of oranges, and eventually you talk.
In particular, the attack on your identity, the name calling and things like that was just so hard emotionally on people that they buckle under that pressure.
Right. So, what you want to do is just make sure that it's a good story, right? And that the story that you want to tell is the story you should be telling. Because the Inquisition detail was one of the things I could drop in a heartbeat. And the story didn't change. So I clearly didn't need that. Something bad had to happen to the character, there had to be some conflict. Didn't have to be the Spanish Inquisition with mustache twirling and red hats. So, but it's also not, I ran out of oranges today. That's not good enough conflict. It has to be a good story.
I think that we're kind of born storytellers to a certain degree, and that we try to make sense of the world, and that we tell ourselves stories even when they're not true. I mean, for example, if you suffer from depression, you can sit down and come up with all sorts of reasons why you suffer from depression. My father beat me when I was young, I was tormented by my peers at school, and all of this kind of bullshit. None of it's true. The truth is that you're suffering from depression because you've got a chemical imbalance in your brain. But for generations, we've been trained to look for reasons that really, have nothing to do with what's going on. Because we are problem solvers, and so you have to trust yourself that if you get into a story and you feel like you're going off in a different direction or whatever, it's not necessarily the wrong direction, it's just a new direction. And you'll figure out a way to tell that story sometime.
Thank you.
We have just about a moment left, so.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Yeah, be quick.
So I have a guilty pleasure that I suspect both of you share, the historical novel. And I want to use as an example Colleen McCullough's first Bandit in Rome series, which I loved. And this is a tremendously researched series about a period of time in which we have tremendous amounts of historical data to go. And so, having done all the research, she then gives all these major political figures personalities, gives them greed, gives them lust, gives them anger, hatred, betrayal, and all the things that you might find in Shakespeare, only as a series of novels, with famous people in Rome in the middle and being the main characters. And what I wanted to ask you is, let's say you want to do a period of time with characters, both real and some fictional, in which there isn't as much good material as the late Roman Republic. There just aren't that many books, there aren't that many, original sources. What do you do?
This book right here is written about a guy named William de Hogville, or William Ironheart. There are exactly 5 lines of text about this man in the history of Europe, but they're awesome lines. Right? The Hogville family basically were involved in every major conflict in the 11th century, but the important ones happened in the second half of the century. All the important stuff that happened in the beginning, it was just, and he did this, and he did this, and then he died. And he did this, and he did this, and then he died. So I've got an entire action movie written here about a guy who there's 5 lines in the historical record that we've seen. There were probably a whole bunch of stuff written about this guy in 1056 AD.
Yeah. But you had to supply most of the rest.
I put it on with him. I couldn't kill him. I couldn't give him a child out of wedlock because those things didn't happen. But he was a soldier and he did soldiery things.
But you can give him friends and enemies and bosses and subordinates and
Yeah, there are. If you can write a book about what I did for lunch, right?
Yeah.
And I mean, a whole bunch of crazy stuff happened between the time I got here in the morning and by the time he's here at 4 o'clock.
And all that stuff that you're creating, how do you get that as accurate as possible?
Research.
Okay.
It's just a watchword. We've said to everyone who came up, but it's, don't give the guy 2 heads, right?
Yeah.
But if you didn't speak English, write that down.
Sure.
If you couldn't read, write that down. It's an important plot point. We're all literate, right? 90% of the world wasn't.
Yeah.
For a very long time.
Thank you very much. We are scheduled to go into the signing room for an hour. So if you have any further questions that we weren't able to get to, please feel free to come and speak with us.
And I do have some flyers up here on my writing workshops that are coming up, so if you're interested in those.
I think there are 4. Okay. Oh, please exit out this way. Sorry. I want to wait for my door.
We are funneling you towards the authors and books.
I'm sorry. I forgot about it.
Oh, you did?
Oh, thank goodness. Oh, that's a relief.
I thought you were right behind me.
I spent a lot of time on location.
You know that reprobate over there? You do? How did it know me yet? The rep? Really? Yeah, I heard that, yeah. It's a great work. I love it.
Logan.
Welcome back.
Can't get rid of me.
I do need to clear the room for the next panel. Got a capacity crowd. I am clearing the room for the next panel. Yes. Because I've got 100 people who want to get in.
How is it reasonable at all? Did I even clear the big panel?
I think we're this one. Well, yesterday because the same 60 people stayed all night. So.
Well, I was worried about this.
They've been waiting for 2 hours.
How is that?
Conventions make me feel like I'm a kid again.
Oh, I guess.
And not in a fun way.
Oh,
And then it's 8 o'clock, let's go to bed.
This is your scheduling.